Hi there, my name is Drew James and I'm going to be taking you through how to strum a guitar today. Now, it sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? But really, nothing could really be further from the truth. It is simple enough. You can walk past any guitar regardless if you play it or not and just glide your fingers over it because you think you're curious about what it's going to sound like when you strum it. And if you're a beginner guitarist, it can feel as easy as that initially, but what you will find is that when you're holding the plectrum or when you're even using your fingers, you may start to get inconsistent sounds from your strumming, and it can also sometimes be a very often overlooked thing. People always think that it's about the chord changing and don't necessarily concentrate on their strumming hand. So I'm going to be giving you some hints and tips today and a practical playing exercise at the end to get you strumming effectively. Now, little disclosure before we have a look at the left hand and I'll show you how to strum. A lot of this is subjective, okay? And I will be telling you the stuff that is subjective throughout with each tip that I give you, okay? So the rules are there to be broken sometimes, and it does work for some people depending on their hand shape and depending on how long they've been playing the guitar. And I'm never going to say that something is necessarily a bad habit, but what I'm going to be doing is giving you a solid foundation if you are a complete beginner for how to strum correctly. So let's get started with, should you be using a plectrum or using your thumb and fingers? And once again, this starts off with the subjective thing. It really does depend on your taste in music, how comfortable it is for you, and just really what you're used to. There is no right or wrong answer, in my opinion. I have got, I'd say about 50% of my students strum with their thumb and index, and the other 50% prefer to use a plectrum. If you prefer sort of a slightly more mellow sounds to your playing, then yes, you would use your thumb. But if you want it sounding a little bit more lively, a bit more rock, then a plectrum would do that just fine. Now for today, I'm not going to be showing you how to use your thumb, but I just thought I would sort of reassure you in case you're thinking, well, should I be learning with a pick as well? I mean, there's certainly no harm in maybe trying a plectrum a little further down the line when you've been learning, but initially, just to get your sense of tempo and your sense of rhythm and to get a nice sound out of the guitar that you're happy with, use whatever is comfortable. If this video gets 100 or more likes, then I will also do a rhythm guitar video showing you how to use your thumb and index as well. Okay, so let's get started on the actual pick itself. Now, if you're completely new to the guitar and you've only been playing maybe a couple of months, then I recommend using a thin plectrum. So that means between 0.20 and 0.50 millimeters to get started with. I think the best one that I say to most of my students is Tortex Reds, they're called, which is 0.50 millimeters. That gives you the best of both worlds. It's not paper thin, so it doesn't splash about on the strings and you don't hit your thumb into the strings as much, but it's not so thick that it's unruly, which I will take you through in a little while. You also use different picks depending on what you're doing. So for example, for electric guitar playing, I would use a thicker pick. For acoustic guitar playing, I would use something a little bit thinner. So picks is a whole new lesson entirely, but for the complete beginners out there, which I want to keep this lesson towards, or for beginners and improvers, I would recommend 0.50 millimeters. You can't go wrong with that. So let's actually get into holding the pick as well. So what you need to be doing is you need to be holding the pick with your thumb and index finger, okay? Now, bad playing habit would be holding like this, okay? What you need to be doing is holding with thumb and index finger. Now, the other way to think about it is, so you're gripping here. Notice I'm gripping quite a lot of the plectrum, so I'm not back here on the pick. I'm gripping a lot. But the other sort of missing link here that a lot of times you don't really notice is that the pick doesn't go flat like this when I'm strumming. Okay? What it actually does is it goes on top of the side of my index finger. And notice that my index finger is actually at an angle, a 45-degree angle at the back of the pick. So that's quite important to note. You know, we're not holding it like this. We are actually keeping it at an angle. And while I've got this position as well, I'll just show you that, notice that there is sort of a rectangular hole in my hand, okay? So I'm not tense like this, and that's quite important to leave that there. And speaking of tension, let's talk about how to make your picking sound a bit more relaxed. So these fingers here should not be tight. They should not be in a ball, all right? So we're not strumming like this, and we're definitely not strumming sticking the plectrum in our fist like this. I've seen students do it like this, grabbing the pick and then going. Okay, because what you're going to get is a really harsh sound, and it means that the plectrum is too far up on the top of your index finger. It needs to come down, okay? So loosen these fingers. Now that may mean that you need to stop this middle finger from attaching itself to the index finger, okay? So let these hang so that they are chilled out and loose. You don't want to go too far the other way, which is start sticking them out, but make sure they're not glued together like this. Let them hang and let it be loose. That could be seen as a subjective thing. I do have a couple of students that prefer to keep their fingers up like this, but I personally don't. I think it's nice to keep these loose. And then that gets on to the next thing. When you're strumming, you should never be pivoting from your elbow like this, okay? What we're looking for is a flick in our wrist. So almost think of it like you're flicking your little finger out to the guitar like this. Rather than okay, it's a lot harder to have control over volume, and the plectrum is more likely to slip out of your fingers if you're pivoting from your elbow like this the whole time. So make sure that you're just relaxing that wrist, flicking the hand out. It's the best way of thinking about it, like flick your hand out. Next, how tightly should you grip the pick? Well, this is definitely subjective, and it depends on a lot of factors. And this is the reason why strumming can seem quite challenging in the beginning, because you don't know how tight to hold the pick, and if you hold it too tight, you get that really sort of brash, nasty sort of sound. If you hold it too loose, you might drop it. You feel the pick turning in your fingers, or the pick falls in the sound hole. So as a general piece of advice, you should hold the plectrum tight enough so that someone could take it out of your fingers. Now they should be able to take it out of your fingers reasonably easy, but it doesn't want to really sort of give up too much of a fight on it, okay? That's a general piece of advice. Now this is where things get very subjective, and it's down to the song. So with strumming, depending on if you're doing a song that's louder, then you're going to hold the pick tighter to get a harder sound out of the guitar. If the song is softer, then you're going to hold the pick slightly lighter to get a lighter sound out of the guitar. Okay? Now, from strum to strum, and even from part to part in a song, you are continuously changing the grip on your plectrum, and this is what takes a few years to develop. Okay, so don't be expected to get that overnight. Just look for a consistent volume when you're strumming at the moment. Okay, so no sort of extra, oh, okay, that one's a loud one. Okay, so that's my advice with holding the pick. That is one thing that takes a little while to get comfortable with, the actual hold of the pick. But if you're gripping it with your thumb and index, you've got the plectrum on the top, you've got the right thickness pick, and you're putting in the right amount of plectrum into the strings, okay? So if we were, that's another thing that I will talk about now. So if we were strumming a song and it was a bit louder, then we're going to come back on the pick, so we've got more to hit with. If it's a bit quieter, especially if we're picking the strings, then we hold more of the plectrum, okay? Whereas if I'm strumming, I'm holding back on the plectrum. So that's another little tip as well. You actually change the amount of plectrum that goes into the strings depending on the song and what you're doing. As a general rule, the tip of the plectrum should be pointing into the sound hole of the guitar, right? So if you're finding that you're strumming back here, It's probably because the guitar's a little too big for you. I mean, you could still learn guitar and you can strum there, it's absolutely fine. But if you do want to go and buy yourself a new guitar, make sure when you're holding it comfortably, you can be over the middle of the sound hole, okay? Consequently, if you're over here, then the guitar's too small for you, all right? So make sure you're just in the middle of the sound hole. Okay, next. How much angle should the pick have when we're hitting the strings? Once again, subjective warning, okay? It is different for different guitarists, but my advice that I say to all beginners is make sure that the plectrum is parallel to the strings. Adding a little slice to turning it slightly, the angle of the plectrum, is good because we've got a softer sound. And that can be good for beginners, and I totally recommend that. But I'm about to really get into the nitty-gritty of holding the plectrum in a moment, and then you'll see why I don't really like the method of turning it like that. So I always recommend keeping it straight and into the strings when you're strumming, okay? No angle, no turning it, keeping it like that. And this is the reason. You start off with a thin pick as a beginner, because you don't know how tightly to grip the pick. So what you need the pick to give for you. Okay, so it kind of gives and bounces against the strings. All right, and that's obviously very, very important, because if you were holding like a 2p coin in your hand or some sort of coin, then when you're strumming it would feel very harsh and very abrasive, and the plectrum will be moving a lot in your hands. So what you need to understand is, when you hold the plectrum, is that when you strum and when you get more experience, it's not about the plectrum giving, it's about you and your grip letting the pick move at the back of your fingers, like I'm demonstrating here. Okay, so as it comes into contact with the string, it's actually the pick moving, right? So obviously if we wanted to play harder, we would tighten it a little bit and the pick would move less. But it's all about the pick making the movement. And that's why with thinner picks, it does the movement for us. But when you start to exercise good control over the plectrum, you will let the plectrum move for you in the back of your hand. And this is the reason why I don't like slice picking, because slice picking will only give you one even tone. And you can't really get much louder. Whereas if you've got an angle to the pick, you can start quiet by letting the plectrum move more at the back, and then you tighten your grip, keeping it parallel, to get it louder. Which gives you a much greater room of dynamics, which is so important if you're a guitarist. You've got to learn about loud and quiet. So learn how to let the plectrum give and move in the back of your fingers like that, all right? That is very, very important. Okay, and also I just can't stress this enough. You're obviously going to be experimenting with different, with how tight you're holding the plectrum. If you're feeling the plectrum slip in your fingers, then it could be that you're holding the plectrum too tightly, so you just need to loosen off a little bit. Also, having the right thickness of plectrum makes a big difference with that. Now, people say to me, okay, Drew, so what about upstrokes? So when you're doing an upstroke, what is it exactly that, are you doing anything different? I'm still using my wrist is happening. And on an upstroke, I'm much more intuitive to the tip of my finger, my index finger gives on an upstroke. And that stops things being like this. And making it sound, you might get that harsh sort of catchy sound, all right? So what I'm doing, and once again, this will take time, but I'm letting the tip of my finger, I'll try it with this camera here, I'm letting the tip of my finger give on the upstroke. So on the upstroke, it's giving like that. You see that? That's a much more extreme example, but I'm letting the top finger joint give. And that's giving me a softer sound on my upstroke, which I know sometimes beginners have problems with. Okay, so that is all my tips. I'm going to finish by saying that strumming is one of those things that does take the longest to master and to become versatile with and to feel very, very comfortable with. Learning the chords doesn't take half as long as what getting the strumming right does. So I'm going to finish just by setting you an exercise here, and I'd like you to take an E chord. I'd like you to get used to just strumming down strums, all 6 strings. Flicking the wrist, and really go back to basics. Even if you've been playing guitar a little while, hopefully these tips will really make you think differently about how you're holding the plectrum. Are you feeling it give? Once again, it doesn't actually matter if the top of your fingertip does occasionally touch the strings as well. That doesn't matter. But just get used to, set a metronome, any speed you like. Actually, 80 BPM is a good speed. And just get used to gliding the plectrum down the strings and feeling that pick give and take in the back of your hand.